Welcome back to our Jewish journey through the Gospel of John. Now, previously on our Jewish journey through the Gospel of John, we covered the end of chapter 4. Let's review, let's remind ourselves of where we've been as we dim the lights, bring the volume up, we shall see. And so we leave chapter 4 with that wonderful verse which we just heard. So the Father knew it was at that hour which Jesus said to him, "Your son lives," and he himself believed, and his whole household. This is the second sign, again, tying together in a nice bow the first sign in Cana, the second sign in Cana that Jesus performed when he had come out of Judea into Galilee. And now, new material. Chapter 5. After these things, that's an unspecified period of time. After these things, there was a feast of the Jews, a Jewish festival, in other words, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Generally, it is thought that it is one of the 3 pilgrimage festivals that we're talking about, but it's an unnamed feast. And Jesus goes up for Hanukkah as well, so it doesn't necessarily need to be one of the 3 pilgrimage festivals, Passover, Pentecost, or Tabernacles. It's an unnamed feast, and the point being that Jesus is squarely centered in Jerusalem. The action is shifting from Galilee to Jerusalem. That's the point. And the point of the holiday is not the festival week that brought him to Jerusalem, but the fact that this event occurs on Shabbat. This is the chart of the Jewish festivals in John's Gospel. We see that the first few chapters are the overarching theme occur in conjunction with a Passover, and then possibly chapter 5 is dealing with the second Passover that we see, but again, unnamed feast. And again, doesn't matter what the festival was because John is going to be concentrating on the fact that this is Shabbat. So as far as the Jewish festival that John is focusing on, it is Sabbath, not Passover or any of the other holidays it could possibly have been that would put Jesus in Jerusalem. So, moving forward, verse 2. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate, one of the northern gates near the east, there's a pool, just called in Hebrew, actually Aramaic, Bethesda, house of mercy. Beit Bethesda, house of mercy, having 5 porticos. Now, before we go on, I want you to notice the verse, the word that I've highlighted there. Very, very important. I think it's very, very important. There is in Jerusalem. It has to do with the perspective of which John is writing. Now, some would say that John is writing from a historical perfect or historical future, and he's just saying that there is a sheep gate, or in my memory there's a sheep gate. It's not there anymore, but there is. I think that where it says Eston, there is, means there is. So if there is this pool with the porticos, then it needs to be a period of time before Jerusalem was sacked by the Romans and the customs change and the Jewish practices change and the destruction of the temple in 70. So for me, this is an excellent bit of evidence to lead one. Is it conclusive? No, but it's an excellent piece of evidence that would lead one to think, perhaps John really did write this before the destruction of the temple, which would put the composition of the Gospel of John in the late 60s. Certainly no later than the late 60s, because he's speaking of this pool, Bethesda, as actually still being there and actively used. But again, That's an aside, little extra bit of information thrown in, no extra charge. And anyway, it has 5 porticos. For a long time, centuries, people read this passage and they said, we've not discovered a pool with 5 porticos. And they're imagining a building, a structure that is shaped like a pentagon, 5 porticos. And they said, well, John is making this. This is obviously evidence that John is writing far, far in the future from the time of these events. He doesn't really know what he's talking about. This guy probably never even was in Jerusalem. He's probably not even, maybe he's not even Jewish. Who knows? Because he doesn't know there's no such thing as a 5-porticoed pool shaped like a pentagon, like the Pentagon. And the answer is, there is no such thing as a 5-porticoed pool shaped like the Pentagon. Wouldn't you know, they found in the 20th century, they found a 5-portico pool right where it said, but not in the shape of a pentagon. In the shape of 2 squares that share a wall, a portico, a section. So in other words, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 porticos, just like so. This is what it looks like in the model. That is what it looked like. The portico, what's a portico? Portico is a colonnaded area. See, the northern pool and you had a southern pool. Okay, and the porticos looked something like this. And it's located, for those of you who have been to Israel with me, it is located, as you can see, just slightly south of the, or north rather, of the Temple Mount. You can see the Temple Mount right there. This is Temple Mount's over here. You can see St. Anne's Church. Remember St. Anne's Church where we sang? Yes, this is that area. And I told the story, and this is the pools that we just saw. So going backwards, this is what it looked like. This is what's left of it today. Okay. And here we have the Temple Mount, and this is that area right here, St. Anne's, and the pools of Bethesda right there. So close. We're literally a stone's throw. It's the Muslim quarter, even though it's a church, and so close to the Temple Mount. And this, as we explored and saw, these are the steps leading down to this pool. Now, of course, people have built since then. The Byzantines had built there, and lots of Crusaders built there. So there's lots of other building refuse. But if we get right down to the cases, you can see those were the steps down to the pool. So in these lay a multitude, in the porticos, of those who were sick, blind, lame, and withered. So Herod the Great would have built, these pools had been there for quite some time, very ancient, place of healing and therapeutic waters. And Herod had built these lovely colonnaded porticos to keep the sun and the elements off and be more comfortable. And of course, Herod was a crazy fancy builder, and so he built something magnificent. But point being, this place was, I hate to use this word, infested, but this place was, let's say, chock full of sick, blind, lame, and withered, disabled people who were there for not just therapeutic waters, but for miraculous waters. They were waiting for the moving of the waters. Verse 4 is not in the most reliable text that we have. However, I would normally say, well, since it's not the most reliable manuscript families, it's probably not original. However, if you don't have this verse that's in italics there, then you have a gap in the story that doesn't make sense. So I think it's more likely ultimately for someone, a copyist, to have left out a verse, for somebody to have inserted it later on. But nonetheless, this gives us an explanation as to why these people are there. For an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred up the water. Whoever then first, after the stirring up of the water, stepped in, was made well from whatever disease with which he was afflicted. So this is the expectation, whether it's a superstition, whether it's actual. We have a circumstances being described to us. Whatever the situation with the stirring of the waters, we never deal with it because it's not necessary with Yeshua there, but I get ahead of myself. Now a man was there, among all the lame and the disabled and the withered and the hurting people. A man was there who had been ill for 38 years. Now it's interesting that you see Jesus and you don't have any description of, and Jesus and his disciples, or Jesus and his entourage. Right? Certainly you see Jesus' entourage, his disciples with him in the previous chapter, walking with him to Samaria and then to Cana and dealing with the official from Herod's palace. But here we just have Yeshua. And perhaps this is one of those moments when Yeshua is without his disciples, maybe he is just on his own. The big city, trying to be anonymous, although many people knew who he was. I don't know how anonymous he would have been. But nonetheless, no entourage here. When Jesus, Yeshua, saw him lying there, so why is Jesus going there to begin with? It doesn't tell us. Jesus, it's a hot day. Jesus wants to take a dip in the pool. What's the reason that Jesus is even there? No background, because it's inconsequential in regard to what John is going to share with us. We don't know the whys, the wherefores of why Jesus is there, but Jesus nonetheless is there. And he sees the man lying there. And he knew it had already been a long time in that condition. Knew because supernatural knowledge, possibly. Knew because he made some inquiries, possibly. Doesn't say. Not the point of the passage. So anyway, he knows he'd been there for a while, long time, in that condition, 38 years. And he asked him a question. And it might seem that this is an obtuse question. But nonetheless, it's the question that needs to be answered. Do you wish to get well? Do you wish to get well? And the sick man answers, but doesn't answer the question. A simple yes or no would have sufficed. Do you wish to get well? Hot diggity. That's actually in Hebrew we'd say hot diggity, but that's right. Yes or no? You betcha. Golly, yes. Or no? I'm just working on my tan. I mean, why you lay? I'm laying here. Of course, I want to get well. But that's not what the man answers. The sick man answered him, Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water's stirred up. But while I'm coming, another steps down before me. It's so pathetic. So sad. I'm here. I'm lame. And generally the first guy in the pool is the one who gets the goodies. But because I'm lame and I don't have anybody here to put me in the pool, by the time I make my way down the final steps into the water, someone has beat me to the punch and I'm the rotten egg. So I don't know really how to read this passage. Is it a whine? Is it an angry grumble? Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred, one coming, another step. Or is it, sir, I have no man to put me in the pool in order to stir, right? And over and over again, when I'm coming, somebody always is faster than me because I'm lame. I don't know how to read that passage. I just know it's not an answer to Jesus' question. Jesus doesn't wait for an actual answer to the question. He hears what the guy said, like Judge Wapner used to say. I've heard your complaint. I've read your testimony. I've read your statement. Yeshua simply says, 3 commands. Get up. Pick up your pallet, your mat, and walk. 3 commands. No time for whining here. Jesus is not going to call the man a wambulance, right? Not going to play a violin for him. He's simply going to take action, right? He has no man. Jesus is his man. 3 commands. Get up, pick up, walk. Now, these are the kind of mats that we're talking about, woven out of just material. Nothing. I mean, this is not a Tempur-Pedic mattress that he's sitting on. It's rather light. It's quite portable and not particularly comfortable, but it's something. It's better than nothing. It's better than the kick in the teeth. And he doesn't take his mat, roll it up like a sleeping bag, and walk. Now, for those paying attention to the Gospel of John, we've seen many allusions, quotations, and illustrations from the Hebrew Bible, from the Old Testament. For a lame man to be healed, and I can only assume that that's what's about to happen based upon Jesus' track record thus far in the previous 4 chapters, knowing his ultimate biography from the prologue in chapter 1. Makes me think of the prophecies of Messianic age. The Messianic age that the Hebrew prophets spoke of are characterized by this in Isaiah 35:6. Then the lame will leap like a deer. The tongue of the mute will shout for joy. Waters will break forth in the wilderness and streams in the Arava. So it's the first clause that we're concerned. The lame will leap like a deer. So I am, if Yeshua is as I anticipate from trusting what John has recorded thus far in 4 chapters, I'm going to place my bets on Yeshua and say that if he says to the lame man, 38 years, get up, pick up your pallet, and walk, that's exactly what's going to happen. Let's see. Suspense is killing me. Immediately, the man became well. Really? Immediately? You're telling me that 38 years of atrophied muscles and unused... If I'm sitting on the couch playing video games for 3 hours, by the time I try to get up, my thighs are already atrophied. 38 years, I'm only 3 hours playing video games, and I'm tired. My muscles aren't working. But immediately, the man became well and picked up his mat, his pallet, and began to walk. Yes, sir. No complaints now. No whiny backstory. It's okay. Began to walk. Thus endeth the miracle, but not the story. John now drops a little tidbit of helpful information contextually. We always have to ask questions like who, what, when, how, where, why, right? We're going to get the when dropped like a bomb on us right now. Now, it was the Sabbath on that day. Now, when you see this phrase, Sabbath, on that day, or that day was the Sabbath, either way. It is throughout the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, when you see this phrase, and those like it, it is demanded of the reader that you supply the requisite dun dun music to accompany that cue. Now, it was the Sabbath on that day. Dun dun. Now, don't make me do it by myself. Come on, okay? Now, it was the Sabbath on that day. Dun dun dun. So I'm set now for something bad to happen. So the Jews, remember when we see the Jews in John more times than not, we're talking about the Jewish leadership. We're talking about the cultural and religious and economic elite, political elites. The Jews were saying to the man who was cured, so here's this guy, 38 years, and now he's been laying at this pool. Anybody who's gone for a dip has seen this guy with his band of brothers. And to say, and now, which is Hebrew for he's walking around with his pallet. And the Jewish leadership see this guy, this lame guy who's healed. And they say to the man who was cured, it is Shabbat. It is not permissible for you to carry your pallet. Let that sink in for a second. Here's a lame man laying at the portico, at the pool, waiting to be healed, continually frustrated. Now he's walking around with his mat, not laying on the mat because he's no longer lame. He's walking around, and the Jewish people see it, and the first thing they can say to this guy, it's Shabbat. It's against the law. It's against the law for you to carry your pallet. Against what law? Let's take a look. In Exodus, it doesn't say anything about carrying. In the books of Moses, it doesn't. Jeremiah is about the closest you can get in the scripture. It's Jeremiah 17:21. Thus said the Lord, take heed for yourselves and do not carry any load on the Sabbath day or bring anything in through the gates of Jerusalem. This is basically writing to merchants and workmen, don't be doing your job on Shabbat. Even things that are tangential to your job, like setting up for the next day. I know you're taking off for Shabbat, whatever, but don't be like loading up the warehouse or bringing orders in from outside the city so that you can be all set for the next day. Do not carry any load. So, okay, well, there it is. Okay, doesn't say anything about carrying your little personal mat. But the rabbis, however, the Mishnah, the Mishnah was codified, written about 150, 170 years after the time of the Gospels, but this represents much older traditions, the oral law. And the Mishnah defines what work is. Remember what Shabbat is all about, do no work. So the Mishnah defines what work is. The rabbis, the primary labors, work in other words, primary definition of work is 40 less 1. Which is another way of saying, we got 39 divisions. I'm not going to give you all 39. I'm going to give you about half of those, right? So you get an idea. Sowing, plowing, reaping, binding sheaves, threshing, winnowing, selecting, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking. You can understand this, right? Okay. And then we're going to skip, if we want to, skip a few. And we're going to go to the end. Writing 2 letters. Not letters as in Dear John and Dear Jane. Writing like A and B, Aleph and Bet. Okay? And then erasing Aleph and Bet in order to write Gimel and Dalet. Okay? Another 2 letters. Building, tearing down, extinguishing, kindling, striking with a hammer. And here's the final one, number 39 out of 40, or 39 out of 39. Carrying out from one domain to another. So carrying from one location to another is considered by the rabbis to be work, Mishnah 7:2. And if one carries out, is further specification. If one carries out a living person on a bed, he's not liable. In other words, you're carrying the bed, but there's somebody on it. The bed is secondary, right? Even in respect to the bed, because the bed is secondary to him. So if somebody's lying on the bed, it's like you're transporting Cleopatra, let's say, right, on the bed. So if you carry Cleopatra on the bed, You're not breaking the Sabbath because you're not really carrying the bed as a primary purpose. You are carrying the queen. If you're carrying, let's say, a paralytic, someone who can't walk, and you're carrying him by the bed, then again, that's also okay. You're not breaking the law because you're carrying a person. You're actually not carrying the bed. The bed is secondary to the person. However, think about this, if the paralytic carries his own bed, right, then he's violating Shabbat. You see, the rabbis didn't really think all of the various permutations through. They didn't think it through all that way because they weren't assuming that this was going to happen, a paralytic carrying his own bed. But nonetheless, because the paralytic carrying his own bed, he's breaking the Shabbat. I call that an irony alert, right? Instead of being focused on, wow, this guy who was lame is now healed, how interested am I in finding out more information? Oh, yes. I am actually only focusing on the fact that this lame man who was formerly paralyzed is breaking Shabbat now. Now that you're healed, the first thing you did, break Shabbat. Irony alert. But he answered them. So the Jewish leadership asking him, who did this? Why are you doing this? What's going on? And the man who is healed says, he who made me well was the one who said to me, pick up your pallet and walk. In other words, okay, I admit it. He did it, right? It's his fault. I'm just the secondary cause here. I'm just following the direction of the guy who healed me. He's the one who's ultimately responsible for me breaking Shabbat. Take up your problem with him. So they asked him, who is the man who said to you, pick up your pallet and walk? We will take up our issues with him. But the man who was healed did not know who it was. Are you kidding me? You strike up a conversation. Obviously, you're going nowhere. You're laying here. You strike up a conversation with a guy who comes, you want to be healed. The guy says, okay, get up, take up your pallet and walk. And the first thing you say is, thank you? I mean, what do you say? Who are you? Where do I send a thank you card? What are you going to say? What is wrong with this guy? He's disabled. But now that he's healed, he's pathetic. His answer when he was lame was pathetic. It was a no answer. And his behavior, to me, is, let's just say, a disappointment. I'm disappointed in you, man, who was healed. You didn't even ask, what's the name of the guy to say thank you? Was Jesus so slippery? He's a slippery individual. He slipped away while there was a crowd in that place. Yeah, it's crowded at the pool. But how unobservant are you that you allow this guy who healed you to disappear without even finding out his name? I'm very disappointed in that fellow. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple. So this guy obviously lost track, quite easily, of Yeshua, gave him the slip. But Yeshua never lost track of this guy. Yeshua knew where this guy was the whole time. And he found him in the temple. And what he says to him is telling. Behold, you have become well. Do not sit anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you. You know, people try to get themselves into all kinds of interpretive knots, trying to figure out what Jesus actually meant by that. Is he talking about the big picture that something worse, i.e. ultimately judgment is coming, so live a life without sin? Yeah, who's going to do that, right? No, I think what Jesus is actually saying is what it says. You're well now. Don't sin anymore so that nothing worse happens to you. In other words, Jesus, and we're not privy to what the correlation is, but Jesus certainly is making a connection between the fact that this guy was sick and something morally, ethically in his life. Not that every sickness, not that every disease, in fact, most diseases, most illnesses, Jesus is very, very clear in other parts of the Gospels. In fact, right in chapter 9. He's very, very clear that no, there are some diseases, some illnesses, some handicaps, some disabilities, some issues, some that have nothing to do with morals or ethics or sin. But in this instance, there's some connection here. And Jesus is keeping it down on the, obviously John's not giving it to us, so we don't know. But Jesus is telling him, look, don't, straighten yourself up, man. Straighten yourself up. He said, nothing worse happens to you. And so the man went away and he lived a paragon, it was a paragon of virtue for the rest of his life, and he lived happily ever after. That's not how the passage ends. The man went away, and he told the Jews, the same Jews who were trying to find a way of accusing Jesus and find out who's breaking the Sabbath, who's breaking these laws. He goes to the same group of people, these legalists, these legalistic police. He told the Jews it was Jesus who made it well, who made it well. Oh, now you've learned his name. Instead of thank you, the first thing you do is you run to the people who are going to make trouble for him. Talk about a fair weather phrase, no friend. No thank you, no nothing. He became his disciple. He followed him. Nothing like this. It's not like the normal healing stories that we see in the Gospels. This one stands out. It's interesting. He told the Jews it was Jesus who made it well. Thank you very much. And for this reason, the Jews were persecuting Jesus. Persecuting is not really the best translation for that. Prosecuting is really the better word. And because they're seeking to prosecute, it turns to persecution over a period of time. And this, apparently, he was doing these things. This is one of several. John is just sharing one with us. Jesus is in the business of healing on Shabbat. And the Jews now have a name, and they're going to prosecute and persecute him because he's doing these things on the Sabbath. What will happen when they find Yeshua? How will Yeshua defend himself? Will there be a defense? Will he be able to speak in his own defense? Or will they now have got the drop on our hero? I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave you in suspense until next time.